The gas lamps backstage at Drury Lane Theatre flickered against the November darkness, casting restless shadows across the worn wooden floorboards where Beatrice Thornhill stood motionless, still wearing half her costume from the evening's performance. The crimson velvet of Lady Macbeth's gown hung heavy on her shoulders, the bodice unlaced where her dresser had begun the transformation back to ordinary life before disappearing into the warren of corridors with a whispered warning that Mr. Henshaw needed to see her immediately. The theatre manager's face, when he finally emerged from his office, clutching an official document sealed with red wax, told Beatrice everything before he spoke a single word. The smell of grease paint and powder mingled with the mustiness of old velvet curtains and the faint trace of smoke from the footlights, scents that had meant home to her for 10 years, scents that now seemed to crystallize into something final and terrible. Mr. Henshaw would not meet her eyes as he read the decree from the Lord Chamberlain's office, his voice flat and administrative, explaining that Miss Beatrice Thornhill was henceforth banned from performing on any major stage in London, the decision made in response to complaints from several influential patrons regarding her controversial and unseemly interpretation of Lady Macbeth, an interpretation deemed dangerous to public morals and disrespectful to the natural order of authority. The words washed over her in waves, each one eroding another piece of the foundation she had spent a decade building, stone by careful stone, rising from a vicar's daughter in a Hampshire village to a respected actress on London's most prestigious stage. Her hands moved automatically to her throat, fingers tracing the paste jewels of her costume necklace, a gesture she had performed as Lady Macbeth not 2 hours earlier, when crying out against the constraints of fate. Mr. Henshaw continued speaking, something about how he personally found her performance remarkable, but his hands were tied. The theatre could not afford to offend the Lord Chamberlain or lose its license. Surely she understood the impossible position. Perhaps in time the matter might be reconsidered, though he could make no promises. Beatrice heard herself thanking him, in a voice that sounded distant and hollow, her training allowing her to maintain composure, even as everything inside her shattered like the porcelain teacup Lady Macbeth had smashed during the sleepwalking scene. The backstage suddenly felt suffocating, the shadows pressing closer, the familiar ropes and pulleys and painted flats that had been her world now seeming like the bars of a cage. She thought of the small rooms she rented in Clerkenwell, the modest savings that would last perhaps 3 months if she were careful, the letters she had just written to her sister describing her triumph in the role. Who was Beatrice Thornhill without the stage, without the transformation each evening into someone larger and more powerful than a woman alone in London, with no family wealth or husband's protection? The question opened beneath her feet like a trap door, and she stood there in her half-removed costume, breathing in the scent of a life that was already becoming memory, while Mr. Henshaw folded the decree carefully and retreated to his office, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like the ceiling of a tomb. The morning light, thin and grey as dishwater, filtered through the narrow window of Beatrice's lodgings in Clerkenwell, illuminating the newspaper spread across her small table like evidence of a crime she had not known she was committing. Miss Martha Caldwell, her landlady, had brought the papers up with breakfast. Her round face creased with concern, her capable hands arranging the teapot and toast with extra gentleness as though Beatrice were an invalid requiring special care. The Times lay open to the theatrical commentary, where a critic whose name Beatrice recognized from more favorable reviews now described her Lady Macbeth as a dangerous perversion of Shakespeare's intent, a woman forgetting her place and using the stage as a platform for seditious ideas unsuitable to her sex. The Morning Post was worse, calling her performance an affront to decent society and praising the Lord Chamberlain's swift action in protecting London stages from such corrupting influence. Beatrice read the words until they blurred, her tea growing cold in its cup, trying to understand how the performance that had felt like her greatest achievement had become the instrument of her destruction. She remembered that night with painful clarity, remembered the moment in the sleepwalking scene when she had departed from the traditional interpretation, when instead of playing Lady Macbeth as a woman consumed by guilt for crimes she had orchestrated, she had shown her as someone destroyed by her husband's ambition, someone who had suppressed her own conscience to support masculine power only to be broken by it. The improvised lines had come from some deep well of truth within her, words about women who bend themselves to men's desires for greatness and are discarded when that greatness curdles into horror. The audience had been utterly silent, and she had felt in that moment that she had touched something real and urgent, had used Shakespeare's framework to speak about the world as it actually was, rather than as men pretended it to be. Now that truth had become her condemnation, twisted in these newspaper accounts into evidence of unfeminine ambition and dangerous thinking. Mrs. Caldwell poured fresh tea without being asked, settling her substantial form into the chair opposite with a sigh that spoke of long experience with the world's injustices. She was a widow who had run this lodging house for 15 years, and she had seen young women of all varieties pass through her rooms, actresses and seamstresses and governesses, women making their way, alone in a city that preferred them silent and ornamental. She told Beatrice that the greengrocer's wife had been gossiping about the scandal that very morning, declaring that actresses were all immoral creatures anyway, and this one had finally shown her true colors. Beatrice felt each repetition of the gossip like a small cut, the accumulated weight of judgment from people who had never seen her work, who knew nothing of the years of discipline and study and sacrifice that had brought her to Drury Lane. Mrs. Caldwell patted her hand and said that some people understood quality when they saw it, that her own brother had attended the performance and come home talking of nothing else for days, but her kindness only made the loss more acute. Beatrice calculated her finances with the part of her mind that remained practical even in disaster. 3 months of rent and food if she were very careful, perhaps 4 if she sold her few pieces of jewelry, and then nothing unless she could find work. Though what work was available to a woman banned from her profession and now marked by scandal, she could not imagine. The study at Pembroke House was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, morning light filtering through tall windows that overlooked the formal gardens where frost still clung to the sculpted hedges, and it was here that Duke Alexander Pembroke sat with the same newspapers that were destroying Beatrice Thornhill's life spread across his mahogany desk, his long fingers tracing the words that condemned her performance with an anger that surprised him in its intensity. He had been in the audience that November night, seated in a private box where he could watch unobserved, indulging the secret passion for theatre that he had learned years ago to hide from his political colleagues, who would see such interests as frivolous and unsuitable for a man of serious purpose. His late mother, before her marriage had confined her to the narrow role of Duchess, had been an amateur actress of considerable talent, performing in private theatricals that had scandalized her own family, and she had taken young Alexander to the theatre whenever his father was away on business, whispering explanations of technique and interpretation that had opened his eyes to the art behind the spectacle. She had died when he was 19, and at her deathbed she had confessed that her greatest regret was abandoning her passion for performance to become what society demanded, a decorative and silent ornament to masculine power. Alexander had never forgotten the hollowness in her voice when she spoke of dreams deferred until they withered into ghosts of what might have been. When Beatrice Thornhill had taken the stage as Lady Macbeth that November night, he had felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of truth being spoken through Shakespeare's centuries-old words, and her improvised additions about women bent to masculine ambition had struck him with the force of personal accusation. making him think of his mother's wasted talent and his own comfortable complicity in a system that crushed anyone who dared to color outside its rigid lines. The performance had been extraordinary, fearless and intellectually rigorous, showing Lady Macbeth not as the monster of traditional interpretation, but as a tragedy of suppressed conscience. And the audience's shocked silence had seemed to him like the silence of people confronted with something too true to dismiss easily. Now these newspaper accounts twisted her artistry into evidence of dangerous thinking, and the Lord Chamberlain had moved with shocking speed to silence her, and Alexander felt the injustice of it burning in his throat like unshed tears. His secretary, Mr. Whitmore, entered with his usual precise knock, carrying the day's correspondence and a reminder that Parliament would soon debate proposed amendments to theatre censorship laws, legislation that Alexander knew was designed to prevent exactly the kind of truth-telling that Beatrice Thornhill had attempted. He dismissed Whitmore with a nod, turning back to the newspapers and the sketch that accompanied one article, an unflattering rendering of an actress with wild eyes and dishevelled hair, nothing like the dignified woman he had glimpsed briefly backstage when he had sent compliments through the theatre manager after her first performance weeks earlier. Alexander had spent his entire adult life being cautious, playing the role of responsible peer, building political influence through careful alliances and measured speeches, but sitting in his study surrounded by the instruments of a woman's destruction. For the crime of being talented and honest, he felt something in him rebel against the careful architecture of his safe existence. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The Theatre Royal in Covent Garden smelled of wood polish and old velvet when Beatrice arrived at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning, her gloves worn thin at the fingertips, and her bonnet carefully arranged to hide the sleepless shadows beneath her eyes, her heart carrying the fragile and increasingly desperate hope that someone in this city might be willing to hear her plea. She had already been turned away from the Haymarket Theatre at dawn, where the manager had refused to even grant her an audience, sending his assistant to inform her through a barely opened door that he could not risk association with her name, and then from the Adelphi Theatre an hour later, where the manager had at least had the courtesy to see her himself, before explaining with genuine regret that his investors had made their position clear. Now she climbed the narrow stairs to the administrative offices of the Theatre Royal, where she had performed Ophelia to great acclaim only 8 months earlier, and found the manager, Mr. Edmund Ross, seated behind his desk, sorting through scripts with the weary air of a man perpetually besieged by problems. He looked up as she entered, and something flickered across his face, not quite sympathy, but not the cold dismissal she had encountered elsewhere, and he gestured for her to sit, though he did not offer tea or any other courtesy that might suggest this was a social call. Beatrice made her case with as much dignity as she could summon, explaining that her interpretation of Lady Macbeth had been grounded in careful study of the text, that she had not intended to cause offence, but to illuminate what she believed Shakespeare himself had written, that her 10 years of professional work should count for something against one controversial performance. Mr. Ross listened with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and when she finished, he sighed and told her that he personally had found her performance remarkable, that he believed the controversy was manufactured by people with agendas that had nothing to do with theatrical merit, but that the Lord Chamberlain's decree was absolute, and no theatre manager in London could hire her without risking his own license. Through the thin walls she could hear voices from the rehearsal hall, actors running lines for an upcoming production of The Merchant of Venice, and she recognized several of the voices as colleagues she had worked alongside, had shared dressing rooms and opening night nerves with, and now their careers continued while hers lay in ruins. Mr. Ross walked her to the door himself, and as they passed through the corridor backstage, she heard the whispers start, saw heads turn, and then quickly look away, caught fragments of conversation that carried both sympathy and something uglier, the barely concealed satisfaction of those who had envied her success, and now witnessed her fall. At the stage door she encountered Miss Caroline Fletcher, a young actress who had understudied several of Beatrice's roles, and Caroline offered a smile that did not reach her eyes, and said how dreadful it all was before hurrying past with an eagerness that suggested she had an audition to attend, perhaps for one of those very roles that Beatrice would never play again. The final confrontation came at the Theatre Royal's front entrance, where she nearly collided with Lord Henry Carstairs himself, the man whose outraged letter to the Times had begun the cascade of her destruction, a florid man of perhaps 50, with the self-satisfied bearing of someone who had never questioned his right to pass judgment on his supposed inferiors. He recognized her immediately, and rather than stepping aside to let her pass, he blocked her path deliberately, his pale eyes cold with contempt as he told her that a woman who used the stage to question the natural authority of men had no place on any English stage, that her performance had been an insult to Shakespeare and to decent society, and that perhaps now she might learn the proper humility becoming to her sex. Beatrice stood very still, feeling the weight of every rejection and humiliation of the past days pressing down upon her shoulders, but she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break, so she met his gaze directly and told him that history would judge which of them had truly understood Shakespeare's intent, then walked past him into the cold December street with her spine straight and her dignity intact, though her hope had diminished to a spark so faint she could barely feel its warmth. The bookshop on Henrietta Street smelled of old leather and printer's ink when Beatrice arrived on a grey December morning, 5 days after her final humiliation at the Theatre Royal, the proprietor Mr. Joshua Green having offered her part-time employment after she had inquired tentatively about purchasing a second-hand copy of Hamlet and mentioned in passing that she needed work. The shop specialized in theatrical texts and dramatic literature, its narrow aisles crowded with shelves that reached nearly to the ceiling, and Mr. Green, a gentleman of perhaps 60 with spectacles that perpetually slipped down his nose, had known immediately who she was, and had surprised her by expressing admiration for her controversial performance and disgust at the small-minded fools who had condemned it. He could not pay much, he had explained apologetically, but he could offer her 3 mornings a week assisting customers and organizing inventory, and the work would at least keep her connected to the theatrical world, even if she could no longer inhabit it as a performer. Beatrice had accepted with a gratitude that made her throat tight, and now she stood behind the counter sorting through a new shipment of French dramatic texts, while pale winter light filtered through the front window, trying not to think about the fact that she should have been in rehearsal for Twelfth Night at this very hour. The bell above the door chimed at 11:30, and she looked up to see a tall gentleman enter, his greatcoat dusted with the light snow that had begun falling, his bearing suggesting both authority and a certain reserved quality that spoke of careful self-control. He removed his hat and glanced around the shop with the appreciation of someone who truly valued what he saw here, not the idle curiosity of a dilettante. And when his eyes met hers, she felt an odd flutter of recognition, though she was certain they had never been introduced. He approached the counter and asked in a low, cultured voice if the shop carried the first folio edition of Romeo and Juliet, and Beatrice, slipping into the role of knowledgeable shopgirl, explained that they had a very fine early edition, not the first folio itself, but a remarkable printing from 1623, and would he like to examine it? She retrieved the volume from its place of honor in the locked cabinet. They began to discuss the play's themes, and she found herself forgetting her caution and speaking with the analytical depth she had developed over years of studying Shakespeare's intent, arguing that Romeo and Juliet was not primarily a love story, but an indictment of the pointless feuds that sacrifice the young to preserve the pride of the old. The gentleman listened with an intensity that reminded her of how Alexander Pembroke had watched her perform weeks ago from his private box, and when she made a particular point about Juliet's agency in choosing death over submission to her family's demands, something shifted in his expression, and she saw the moment he recognized her. There was a brief, charged silence, and then he said quietly that he had seen her Lady Macbeth and had found it the most intelligent interpretation he had witnessed in 20 years of theatre attendance. Beatrice felt colour rise to her cheeks, uncertain whether this was kindness or mockery, but his eyes held no cruelty, only a genuine respect that made something in her chest ache with the loss of what had been taken from her. He purchased the Romeo and Juliet, their hands brushing briefly as she wrapped it in brown paper, and as he prepared to leave he paused at the door and told her that London stages were poorer for her absence, then disappeared into the snow, and she stood staring after him, wondering at his kind eyes and obvious intelligence and the way he had made her feel, for just a moment, like an artist again, rather than a cautionary tale. Alexander Pembroke sat in his private study at Pembroke House on the evening of that same December day, the volume of Romeo and Juliet resting on his desk beside a glass of untouched brandy, his mind occupied not with the parliamentary business that awaited him, but with the woman in the bookshop, whose brilliant mind shone through despite the circumstances that had brought her to such reduced employment. He had recognized her the moment their conversation had turned to Shakespeare's deeper meanings, had seen in her analytical precision and passionate defense of Juliet's agency the same intelligence that had made her Lady Macbeth so extraordinary, and now he found himself unable to dismiss the injustice of her situation as merely another casualty of society's arbitrary judgments. The following morning, he summoned his private secretary, Mr. James Harrison, and instructed him with careful discretion to make inquiries into the exact circumstances of Miss Thornhill's banning, to speak with theatre managers and actors who might provide insight into what had truly motivated the campaign against her, and Harrison, who had served the Pembroke family for 20 years and knew when not to question his employer's requests, returned 3 days later with information that confirmed Alexander's suspicions. Lord Carstairs had indeed led the public outcry, Harrison reported, but the origins of his outrage lay not in genuine moral offence, but in the demands of his mistress, a mediocre actress named Mrs. Violet Chambers, who had long coveted the leading roles that Beatrice's talent had kept beyond her reach. Mrs. Chambers had convinced Carstairs that Beatrice's interpretation of Lady Macbeth was scandalous, had whispered in his ear about the dangerous precedent of allowing women to use the stage for subversive purposes, and Carstairs, who fancied himself a patron of the arts and enjoyed the power that came with his influence over theatrical circles, had obliged her by writing his inflammatory letter to the Times and pressuring the Lord Chamberlain's office to take action. The political dimensions became clearer as Alexander investigated further, speaking quietly with theatre managers who admitted under promise of confidentiality that the censorship had been welcomed by certain conservative factions who saw the stage as a potential vector for dangerous ideas about social reform and women's independence. On a cold afternoon, Alexander met his closest friend, Viscount Robert Fairfax, at their club, and over lunch in a private room he shared what he had learned, watching Robert's expression shift from curiosity to concern as the implications became clear. Robert, who had known Alexander since their school days and understood both his friend's strong sense of justice and his occasionally reckless impulses, advised caution with the earnestness of someone who feared what he saw coming. Involving yourself with a scandalous actress will destroy your political influence, Robert argued. You have worked too hard to build your reputation as a serious reformer to throw it away on a woman you barely know, and besides, the theatre world is full of intrigue and you cannot right every wrong. Alexander listened with the patience of a man who had already made his decision, but valued his friend's perspective enough to hear him out, then replied quietly that some injustices demanded response regardless of personal cost, that a system which could destroy a woman's career to satisfy a mistress's jealousy and powerful men's fear of ideas was a system that needed challenging. Robert sighed and said he had expected as much, asked what Alexander intended to do, and received only the answer that he was still determining the appropriate course of action, but that he could not simply stand by and do nothing. Walking home through the December streets as lamplighters began their rounds, Alexander thought of his mother, who had loved the theatre with a passion his father had dismissed as unseemly, who had performed in private theatricals until her marriage had required her to abandon such pursuits, who had taken young Alexander to every performance she could and taught him to see the stage not as frivolous entertainment, but as a mirror held up to human nature, and he felt his determination crystallize into something unshakable, a resolve that whatever the cost to his political standing, he would find a way to address this injustice, and perhaps in doing so, honor both the brilliant actress in the bookshop and the memory of the woman who had first taught him to value theatrical art. Alexander returned to the bookshop on Henrietta Street 4 days after his conversation with Robert, the winter afternoon dark and biting, as he pushed open the door and heard the familiar chime announce his entrance, and Beatrice looked up from the ledger where she had been recording recent sales, her expression shifting from professional welcome to guarded surprise when she recognized him. He approached the counter with the careful courtesy of a man aware that his presence might not be entirely welcome, and asked if the shop carried a particular edition of The Tempest, though in truth he had come with no purpose beyond seeing her again and finding some way to continue the conversation that had occupied his thoughts since their first meeting. She retrieved the volume he requested, her movements precise and controlled, and as she placed it before him, he asked if she might share her interpretation of Prospero's final speech, the moment when the magician relinquishes his power and asks the audience for release. Beatrice hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether this was genuine interest or the cruel game of a nobleman amusing himself with a fallen woman. But something in his steady gaze seemed to reassure her, and she began to speak about the speech as a meditation on the artist's relationship with their audience, the way every performance was both an assertion of power and a plea for understanding. Alexander listened with the focused attention he usually reserved for parliamentary debates, occasionally offering observations that revealed a depth of theatrical knowledge surprising in a man of his obvious position, and their conversation expanded to encompass larger questions about the purpose of art, and whether it existed merely to confirm society's existing beliefs or to challenge them toward growth. She was more animated now, her guard lowering as intellectual passion overtook caution, and he found himself admitting that he had been present at her infamous Lady Macbeth, that he had witnessed her interpretation, and found it not scandalous but illuminating, perhaps the most honest portrayal of that character he had ever seen. Beatrice went very still, color rising to her cheeks, and asked in a voice carefully stripped of emotion why he would say such a thing when the consensus of London society had judged her performance an abomination. Alexander leaned forward slightly and said with quiet intensity that the consensus of London society was often wrong, that men who feared their own authority questioned, were quick to silence women who dared speak uncomfortable truths, and that her performance had revealed something essential about ambition and complicity that most interpretations glossed over in favor of. Comfortable moral certainty. He saw tears glisten briefly in her eyes before she blinked them away, saw the way his words had touched something wounded and raw, and he realized that perhaps no one since her banning had offered her this simple validation of her artistic vision. They stood in silence for a moment, the shop around them fading into insignificance, and then he introduced himself properly as Alexander, offering only his given name without title, and asked if she might be willing to continue their discussion over tea at a respectable establishment where they might talk more freely. Beatrice studied him with an expression he could not quite read. Suspicion and hope, and something like longing mingling in her dark eyes. And finally she agreed, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she would meet him the following Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon at the tea room on Bedford Street. And as Alexander left the shop with the Tempest tucked under his arm, he felt the stirring of something he had not experienced in years, a sense that his carefully ordered life was about to be disrupted in ways he could not predict, but somehow welcomed. Beatrice arrived at the tea room on Bedford Street on Tuesday afternoon, wearing her best dress of deep blue wool that had seen 3 winters but remained respectable, her heart beating irregularly in her chest, because in the days since she had agreed to this meeting, she had learned through discreet inquiry exactly who Alexander was. Not merely a gentleman with theatrical interests, but the Duke of Ashford, a member of Parliament known for progressive positions on reform. And this knowledge had filled her with equal parts wonder and dread at what his interest in her might signify. She found him already seated at a corner table away from the front windows, and when he rose at her approach, she saw tension in his posture that matched her own, a shared awareness that they were crossing some invisible boundary by meeting here publicly even in this modest establishment. He helped her into her chair with careful courtesy, and they ordered tea from the elderly woman who served them, the ordinary ritual providing brief shelter from the weight of what remained unspoken between them. When the tea arrived and they were alone again, Beatrice decided that honesty was the only path forward, and said quietly that she had discovered his true identity, that she understood now the risk he took by associating with her, and that while she treasured their conversations, she could not in good conscience allow him to damage his reputation for the sake of discussing theatre with a ruined actress. Alexander listened without interruption, his grey eyes steady on her face. And when she finished, he leaned forward slightly and said with an intensity that surprised her that he had not concealed his title to deceive her, but rather to allow them to speak as 2 people interested in art and ideas without the distortion that rank and scandal would impose, and that his reputation was his own to risk as he saw fit. She studied his face, searching for signs of the condescension she had learned to expect from men of his class, that particular cruelty that took the form of kindness before revealing itself as sport, but found only earnest determination and something that looked almost like loneliness. He asked her to tell him about herself, not the actress that London had judged and discarded, but the woman who had chosen that path, and after a long moment of hesitation, she began to speak about her childhood in a Berkshire village where her father served as vicar, about how she had first encountered theatre when a travelling company performed in the church hall when she was 12 years old, and she had felt something awaken in her that made the narrow confines of expected life suddenly unbearable. She told him how she had left home at 18 against her father's wishes, how she had worked for 2 years as a seamstress in a theatre before being given her first small role, how she had studied every performance she could witness and practiced alone in her rented room until her voice grew strong and her understanding of character deepened into something she trusted. Alexander listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite performance. And when she fell silent, he shared his own story. Speaking of his mother who had loved the stage with a passion that society deemed inappropriate for a duchess, who had taken him to performances throughout his childhood and taught him to see theatre as a space where truth could be spoken more directly than in the careful conversations of drawing rooms, and who had died when he was 19, leaving him with a dukedom he had never wanted, and expectations that felt like walls closing in. In his voice, Beatrice heard the echo of her own frustration with a world that sorted people into rigid categories and punished those who questioned the sorting. and she felt the tension between them shift into something warmer, a recognition of kinship that transcended the vast difference in their circumstances. And when he asked if she would allow him to see her again, she found herself agreeing before caution could intervene, her heart making a decision her mind knew was dangerous but somehow necessary. Over the following weeks they met regularly, arranging their encounters with the careful discretion of people who understood the danger their association posed, choosing locations in less fashionable parts of London where the Duke of Ashford would not be expected, and a disgraced actress might pass unremarked. And these walks through Clerkenwell and Shoreditch became a refuge from the constrained worlds they each inhabited. They discussed politics and art with increasing intimacy, Alexander sharing his frustrations about parliamentary colleagues who cared more for preserving their privileges than for the reform England desperately needed, describing the suffocating sensations of speaking words he knew would change nothing while the machinery of power ground forward unchanged, and Beatrice speaking of artistic dreams now impossibly distant, the roles she had hoped to inhabit, the interpretations she had wanted to explore, the ways she had imagined using performance to illuminate truths about women's experiences that polite society preferred to ignore. Their conversations grew more personal with each meeting, the formal boundaries of their first encounters gradually eroding until they spoke with the freedom of old friends, though both remained acutely aware of the attraction building between them like a gathering storm. On a cold afternoon in early January, they walked through the deserted paths of a small park in Islington, the bare trees stark against a grey sky threatening snow, and Alexander suddenly stopped and turned to her and began reciting Romeo's speech from the balcony scene, the words emerging with surprising fluency, and Beatrice realized he knew the entire passage by heart, his voice carrying Shakespeare's longing and wonder. She listened transfixed for several lines before her training asserted itself, and she interrupted to correct his delivery, telling him he was placing emphasis on the wrong words, making the speech about Romeo's desire rather than his astonishment at finding something worthy of that desire, and she demonstrated the proper reading with a passion that made her forget where they were. Alexander tried again, following her instruction, and she coached him through the speech with growing animation, adjusting his breathing and posture, explaining how physical stance shaped emotional truth, and they worked through the passage together until he delivered it, as she heard it in her mind, raw and honest and aching. When he finished, they stood very close on the empty path, her hand still resting on his arm from where she had positioned him, and he was looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch, something beyond admiration or respect, something that frightened and thrilled her equally. She made some light comment about his natural aptitude and stepped back, trying to restore safe distance, and he laughed, but the sound was strained, awareness crackling between them like electricity before a storm, and in that moment, Beatrice understood that what was growing between them had moved beyond intellectual companionship into territory far more dangerous. As they walked back toward the street, his hand brushed hers accidentally, and neither of them pulled away immediately, their fingers touching for perhaps 3 seconds before both withdrew with careful casualness, the brief contact burning through her glove like a brand, and she knew from the tension in his shoulders that he had felt it too, this impossible thing that was taking root despite every rational argument against it. Despite their careful precautions, they were seen together on a Wednesday afternoon in late January by Mrs. Eleanor Whitworth, a widow whose primary occupation consisted of observing the lives of others and distributing her observations throughout London society with the efficiency of a well-run postal service, and by Saturday morning, whispers had reached both their separate worlds, carrying judgment and speculation that transformed their innocent walks into something sordid in the retelling. Beatrice first sensed the change when she arrived at the bookshop on Saturday and found Mr. Davies, the proprietor, watching her with an expression of concern mixed with wariness. And when she asked if something was wrong, he hesitated before saying that perhaps she should be more careful about her associations, given her already precarious position in society. The words struck her like a blow because she had allowed herself to forget during those walks with Alexander that London was always watching, always ready to punish any deviation from prescribed behavior, and the reminder that she remained a scandalous figure whose every action would be interpreted through the lens of moral failure made her feel suddenly exposed and foolish. That evening, Mrs. Caldwell knocked on her door with tea and sympathy, sitting heavily in the worn chair by the window, and saying with genuine kindness that she did not believe the gossip about Beatrice carrying on an improper affair with the Duke, but that others were less charitable, and that several of the other lodgers had expressed concern about the respectability of the house. Beatrice listened with growing coldness in her stomach, understanding that even this refuge was becoming uncertain, that her connection with Alexander was damaging not only herself, but everyone associated with her. Meanwhile, Alexander found himself facing pointed questions from Robert over dinner at their club, his friend's usually cheerful face drawn with worry as he asked if the rumors about Alexander keeping company with the actress Beatrice Thornhill were true. And when Alexander confirmed that he had indeed been meeting with her to discuss theatrical matters, Robert closed his eyes briefly as though pained, and said that half of Parliament was already talking about it, and that Lord Carstairs was telling anyone who would listen that Alexander's judgment had been compromised by an unsuitable woman. Alexander felt anger rise hot in his chest at the characterization, but Robert continued urgently, explaining that Alexander's political position depended on maintaining the respect of his peers, that his progressive views were already regarded with suspicion, and that being seen as the dupe of a notorious actress would destroy any remaining influence he possessed. The conversation left Alexander frustrated and defensive, certain that Robert was wrong, but unable to fully dismiss the warning. The following Monday, Lady Catherine Pembroke arrived at Pembroke House unannounced, sweeping into Alexander's study with the determined air of a woman on a mission, and without preamble she asked him if he had lost his senses entirely by associating publicly with a banned actress whose reputation was already beyond repair. Alexander attempted to defend his friendship, but Catherine interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness, telling him that she cared nothing for society's hypocritical standards, but everything for his welfare, and that this association would give his enemies the weapon they needed to undermine everything he hoped to accomplish in Parliament. By Tuesday afternoon, Beatrice had made her decision, sitting alone in her room with writing paper before her, understanding with painful clarity that Alexander's continued connection to her would only bring him harm, and that the kindest thing she could do for a man she had come to care for more deeply than wisdom allowed was to remove herself from his life before the damage became irreparable. Beatrice sat at the small writing desk in her room on Wednesday evening with a blank sheet of paper before her, the words she needed to write forming and reforming in her mind as she tried to find language that would sever the connection between herself and Alexander without revealing how much that severance would cost her, and after 3 false starts, she finally wrote simply that their friendship had been a gift, but that she could not, in good conscience, continue an association that was damaging his reputation and political standing, that she released him from any sense of obligation toward her, and that she wished him every success in his important work. She sealed the letter before courage could fail her, and sent it by messenger Thursday morning, then went to the bookshop with a sick feeling of loss hollowing out her chest, moving through her duties mechanically, while her mind conjured images of Alexander reading her words. He received the letter at Pembroke House at 10:30 on Thursday, as he prepared to leave for a parliamentary session, and his secretary reported later that the Duke had gone very still upon reading it, his face draining of colour before he folded the paper with careful precision and placed it in his breast pocket, and during the session that followed, he sat rigid in his seat, contributing nothing to the debate, his attention clearly elsewhere, even as he maintained outward composure. On Friday morning he went directly to the bookshop, arriving as Mr. Davies was unlocking the door, and when Beatrice saw him through the window, her heart leapt and broke simultaneously. But she had anticipated this, and had asked Mr. Davies to tell any caller that she was not available, so Alexander stood in the shop speaking urgently to the proprietor, while Beatrice remained in the back room, with her hand pressed to her mouth to keep from calling out to him. He left after several minutes, and she thought that was the end. But within the hour a street child arrived with a note in Alexander's hand, and she opened it with shaking fingers to read words that undermined every rational argument she had constructed for ending things. He wrote that he understood her fears, but that his feelings did not depend on society's approval, that she had awakened something in him that he would not surrender merely because others found it inconvenient, that if she truly wished never to see him again, he would respect that decision, but that she should know he would continue to think of her, and to fight for the principles she had taught him to value more clearly. Beatrice read the note alone in her room that evening, and wept for the first time since receiving news of her banning, crying for what might have been in a different world, and for the necessity of protecting him, even against his own generous heart. The following 2 weeks passed in a grey misery for them both, Alexander growing visibly withdrawn at social functions, snapping at colleagues during parliamentary debates with an anger that seemed to come from some deeper source than the issues at hand, while Beatrice began making inquiries about positions outside London, writing to theatre companies in provincial cities and considering whether she might find work teaching elocution or literature, anything to escape the city that now felt like a prison. She avoided places where she might encounter him, and he respected her unspoken wishes, though Robert reported to Catherine that Alexander spent long evenings alone in his study, refusing invitations and neglecting correspondence, the light from his window visible late into the night. The major parliamentary session on the Theatre Regulation and Moral Standards Bill convened on the morning of March the 3rd in the House of Lords chamber, the vast room filled with peers in their formal robes and observers crowding the galleries, the air thick with the weight of tradition and the murmur of anticipation as Lord Henry Carstairs rose to present his proposal for stricter governmental control over theatrical performances and content. Alexander sat in his usual seat near the centre of the chamber, his posture rigid and his hands gripped tightly on the armrests, as Carstairs began speaking in his polished oratorical style about the moral decay threatening English society through the corruption of theatrical arts. And though Carstairs did not speak Beatrice's name directly, his meaning was unmistakable when he referenced a recent case of a London actress whose willful disregard for propriety and whose inflammatory interpretation of classical texts had demonstrated the urgent need for greater oversight. Alexander felt fury building in his chest like a physical pressure, as Carstairs continued, describing how women of questionable character were using the stage as a platform to spread dangerous ideas about female independence and to question rightful male authority, and how such influences were poisoning the minds of impressionable young people and undermining the natural order that kept society stable. Several other lords murmured agreement, and Lord Pemberton rose to speak in support of the bill, adding that theatres had become gathering places for radicals and that the recent unrest among the working classes could be traced in part to inflammatory theatrical performances that encouraged the lower orders to question their betters. Alexander glanced across the chamber at Robert, who sat watching him with visible concern, and when their eyes met, Robert gave a small but deliberate shake of his head, a clear warning not to engage in a debate that Alexander could not win. The discussion continued with speaker after speaker, rising to condemn the moral laxity of modern theatre, to express concern about actresses who they claimed used their positions to exert inappropriate influence over wealthy patrons, and to argue that women who displayed themselves on stage were inherently unsuitable to interpret works of high literature without male guidance and approval. Alexander's mind filled with images of Beatrice, her intelligence as they discussed Shakespeare in the bookshop, her passion when she spoke about the transformative power of performance, her dignity in the face of society's cruelty, and her courage in pursuing her art despite every obstacle placed before her. He remembered her words from one of their walks when she had said that every generation must decide whether to accept inherited injustices or to challenge them regardless of personal cost, and that the only real failure was knowing better but choosing silence out of fear. Robert caught his eye again, this time more urgently, seeming to sense that Alexander was approaching some precipice. But Alexander looked away and rose slowly to his feet, his heart pounding, but his voice steady as he requested recognition from the Lord Speaker, and the chamber fell quiet as all eyes turned toward the Duke of Ashford, wondering what he could possibly have to say about theatrical morality. Alexander began by thanking the Lord Speaker for the recognition and addressing the chamber with the formal courtesy expected in that ancient hall, but his voice carried an intensity that made even those who had been murmuring fall silent as he stated that he wished to speak in opposition to Lord Carstairs' proposal, not out of any desire to promote moral decay, but rather from a conviction that the bill as presented fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of art and the principles of English liberty. He spoke of how the great works of literature and drama had always served as mirrors held up to society, reflecting not just what was, but what might be, challenging audiences to think more deeply about justice and truth and the human condition, and that to constrain such works to only those interpretations approved by governmental authority was to reduce art to mere propaganda and to impoverish the cultural life of the nation. Several lords shifted uncomfortably as Alexander continued, his prepared political caution falling away as he referenced, without naming her, the recent case of an actress whose interpretation of Lady Macbeth had been deemed dangerous, and he asked the chamber to consider what was actually dangerous about a performance that portrayed a female character as complex and morally conflicted rather than simply evil, whether the real threat was to public morality or merely to the comfort of those who preferred not to think too deeply about the motivations of women or the nature of ambition itself. Lord Carstairs rose on a point of order, his face flushed with anger as he suggested that the Duke of Ashford seemed unusually invested in defending the character of a particular actress, and that perhaps his judgment on this matter was compromised by associations that were themselves questionable, and the chamber erupted in murmurs as all eyes turned back to Alexander to see how he would respond to this barely veiled accusation. Alexander met Carstairs' gaze directly and said with perfect clarity that he did indeed know the actress in question, that he had made it his business to understand the circumstances of her banning, and that he had found her to be a woman of exceptional intelligence, profound artistic talent, and moral character far superior to that demonstrated by those who had orchestrated her professional destruction out of petty vindictiveness and fear of female excellence. The shock in the chamber was palpable, several lords calling out in protest, while others sat stunned that a peer of Alexander's standing would so openly defend a scandalous actress and admit to personal acquaintance with her. But Alexander pressed on, his voice rising as he declared that the hypocrisy of men who kept mistresses and frequented brothels, sitting in judgment of a woman whose only crime was to perform Shakespeare with intelligence and passion, was a stain on the honor of that house. He could see Robert with his head in his hands, and could feel the political alliances he had spent years building crumbling around him. But he thought of Beatrice weeping alone in her room after sending him away to protect his reputation, and he knew that some things mattered more than political survival, that this moment demanded he choose between the safety of silence and the risk of speaking truth regardless of consequence. Alexander felt the chamber slipping into chaos around him, and knew that he stood at the edge of a precipice from which there could be no return. But in that moment of crisis, something clarified in his mind with perfect crystalline certainty, and he raised his voice to cut through the growing tumult and declared that if the assembled lords truly believed that certain interpretations of Shakespeare represented such danger to English morality, perhaps they should have the opportunity to witness the text itself performed before them so they might judge with their own eyes and ears, rather than through the filter of prejudice and rumor. The chamber fell abruptly silent as every face turned toward him with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to dawning horror at what he seemed to be suggesting, and Lord Pemberton called out, asking whether the Duke of Ashford was actually proposing that a theatrical performance take place within the House of Lords itself, which was surely beyond all bounds of propriety and precedent. Alexander met the question steadily and replied that he was proposing precisely that, specifically a performance of the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, that most celebrated exploration of young love defying the arbitrary hatred of feuding families, performed in this chamber so that the lords might experience directly the beauty and moral truth of Shakespeare, rather than condemning it based on fearful assumptions about what theatre might do to corrupt the masses. The reaction was immediate and explosive, with some lords shouting that such a suggestion was outrageous and degrading to the dignity of Parliament, while others laughed openly at what they took to be either an absurd joke or evidence that the Duke had lost his senses entirely. And Lord Carstairs rose again with a smile of cold triumph spreading across his face, as he said that he welcomed the Duke's proposal because it would demonstrate conclusively the absurdity of allowing women to interpret great literature without proper guidance. Alexander felt his heart hammering, but kept his voice level as he asked whether Lord Carstairs was accepting the challenge, whether he was willing to allow a performance to take place in this chamber and to judge it fairly on its artistic merit. And Carstairs replied with elaborate courtesy that he would be delighted to witness whatever entertainment the Duke wished to provide, as it would no doubt prove instructive to all present about the dangers they were discussing. The Lord Speaker called for order, and after several minutes of heated consultation with his advisers announced that while highly irregular, there was no specific rule forbidding such a demonstration if both parties agreed to it, and that if the Duke of Ashford wished to arrange a performance of the scene in question for the edification of the House, it could be scheduled for 1 week hence at the beginning of the next session, though he warned that this precedent should not be taken as an invitation for future theatrical displays. Alexander agreed to the terms, his mind already racing ahead to what he had just committed himself to and who he would need to make it possible, and as the session dissolved into argument and speculation, he walked from the chamber with his head high and his jaw set, ignoring Robert's attempts to catch his attention and the stares that followed him through the corridors. He went directly to the courtyard where his carriage waited, and gave his driver the address of Beatrice's lodgings, knowing that he had perhaps an hour before word of what had happened in Parliament spread through London, an hour to find her and convince her to stand with him in the most audacious and possibly ruinous act of either of their lives. Alexander's carriage clattered through the London streets with unusual speed as he urged the driver toward the modest boarding-house where Beatrice lived, and by the time he arrived, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the narrow street, and his heart was pounding with an urgency that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of taking the stairs 2 at a time to reach her door. He knocked firmly and heard movement within, followed by Mrs. Caldwell's suspicious voice asking who called at such an hour, and when he gave his name, there was a long pause before the landlady opened the door with wide eyes and a hasty curtsy, clearly shocked to find a duke on her doorstep, and she stammered that Miss Thornhill was preparing to depart, and perhaps was not receiving visitors. Alexander asked with all the authority his title carried, whether she would be so kind as to inform Miss Thornhill that the matter was urgent and concerned her professional future, and the landlady retreated down the hall while he waited in the cramped entryway, surrounded by the smell of cabbage and damp plaster that spoke of Beatrice's reduced circumstances. When Beatrice appeared at the end of the corridor, she looked startled and wary, her hair loosely pinned and her dress simple, and behind her, through the open door of her room, he could see a trunk half packed with the few possessions she had retained from her former life. She approached slowly and asked what had brought him here when she had made clear in her letter that they could not continue their association. And he heard in her voice both the pain of that decision and the determination to protect him even at the cost of her own happiness. Alexander glanced at Mrs. Caldwell hovering nearby and asked if they might speak privately, and Beatrice hesitated before nodding and leading him into her small room, leaving the door appropriately open but moving far enough inside that their conversation would not be overheard. He turned to face her in that cramped space, surrounded by her packed belongings and the fading light through a single window, and he began without preamble to tell her what had happened in Parliament that afternoon, how the debate had unfolded, and how Lord Carstairs had attacked her character, and how he had found himself unable to remain silent in the face of such injustice. She listened with growing alarm as he described his defence of her, and then his extraordinary proposal to perform the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet before the assembled lords. And when he finished, by explaining that the performance was scheduled for 1 week hence, and that he needed her to stand with him as Juliet to his Romeo, she stared at him as though he had lost his senses entirely. Beatrice stepped back and said in a voice tight with emotion that what he was proposing was madness, that it would complete the destruction of his political career and accomplish nothing except to provide Lord Carstairs and his allies with further ammunition against both of them, and that she would not allow him to sacrifice everything he had worked for on a gesture that was noble but ultimately futile. Alexander argued with a quiet intensity that cut through her protests, saying that he had already sacrificed his political standing the moment he had spoken in that chamber, that the damage was done and could not be undone by her refusal, but that together they might at least make his sacrifice meaningful by demonstrating the very truth he had claimed to defend. He stepped closer to her in that small room and said that he was not asking her to save him, but to stand with him in an act that transcended both their individual fates, and that whether the lords were moved or remained intractable, whether the press praised or condemned them, he needed to know that he had done everything possible to honor what was right rather than what was expedient. Beatrice turned away toward the window, and he saw her shoulders tremble as she struggled with the weight of the decision, and after a long moment she asked in a voice barely above a whisper whether he truly believed they could make any difference, or whether this was merely a beautiful gesture that would leave them both ruined with nothing to show for it. Alexander moved to stand beside her and looked out at the darkening street below and said that he could not promise success, or even that minds would change, but he could promise that silence and capitulation had never once in history led to justice, and that his mother had spent her entire life being told that her love of performance was frivolous and inappropriate, and had died without ever standing on a stage, and he would not allow that same fate to befall someone with Beatrice's extraordinary gift. She turned to look at him, then with tears gathering in her eyes, and asked what he was truly proposing. And he met her gaze steadily, and said he was proposing that they spend the next week preparing the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, that she would teach him as she had begun to do in the park, and that they would perform it before Parliament with all the skill and passion they could summon. Beatrice searched his face, and he saw the moment when her fear transformed into something else, a spark of the defiant hope that had made her brilliant Lady Macbeth, and she asked whether he understood that she would coach him mercilessly and demand he meet professional standards even though he was a duke. Alexander felt something ease in his chest, and he smiled for the first time since entering her room and said he would expect nothing less, and that if she was willing to stand with him, then he would dedicate himself to becoming worthy of sharing a stage with her. She nodded slowly and said that if they were going to commit this particular form of social suicide, they might as well do it properly, and that they should begin rehearsals immediately, because a week was barely enough time to prepare even a single scene to the level required. Alexander agreed and suggested they use his private study at Pembroke House, where they would not be interrupted or observed. And though Beatrice hesitated at the impropriety of spending extended time alone with him in his residence, she acknowledged that secrecy was necessary if they hoped to maintain any element of surprise. They agreed to begin the following morning, and as Alexander prepared to leave, Beatrice stopped him with a hand on his arm and said that she needed him to understand she was agreeing not because she believed it would succeed, but because his willingness to risk everything had shown her that perhaps some gestures of defiance mattered regardless of outcome, and he covered her hand briefly with his own and said that was all he could ask. On the third morning before the scheduled performance, Beatrice woke from a nightmare in which she stood before the assembled Lords of Parliament and opened her mouth to speak only to find herself voiceless while cruel laughter echoed through the chamber, and she lay in her narrow bed at Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house with her heart racing and a cold sweat dampening her nightgown as the grey dawn light crept through the thin curtains. She had experienced stage fright before in her early years as an actress, but this was something far more visceral and terrible, a dread that coiled in her stomach and whispered that she was leading Alexander toward catastrophe, and that her vanity in agreeing to perform had blinded her to the true cost of their defiance. When she arrived at Pembroke House later that morning for their scheduled rehearsal, she found Alexander already in his study, pacing before the window, and she saw in the tense set of his shoulders and the shadows beneath his eyes that he too had passed a difficult night. They began their run-through of the balcony scene, but the magic that had infused their previous rehearsals seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a mechanical recitation of lines that felt hollow and unconvincing, and twice Beatrice stopped to correct herself on blocking they had already perfected, which betrayed the fracturing of her usually steady nerves. Alexander made an uncharacteristic error in the sequence of Romeo's declarations and swore softly under his breath before apologizing, and Beatrice saw a flash of frustration cross his features that spoke to pressures beyond the rehearsal room. She suggested they take a break, and they sat in the chairs near the fireplace where they had spent so many hours in preparation. But now a strained silence stretched between them, weighted with unspoken doubts. Alexander finally broke the quiet by telling her that 3 more of his political allies had withdrawn their support that morning, and that he had received a letter from the party leadership suggesting he reconsider his planned demonstration, phrasing their concern in diplomatic language that barely concealed a direct threat to his political future. Beatrice felt her resolve crumble further, and she said in a voice tight with emotion that perhaps the leadership was correct, and they should withdraw before the damage became irreparable, and she saw relief flicker briefly in Alexander's eyes before it was replaced by something more complex. He rose and moved to the window and said that he had been thinking the same thing, that perhaps his gesture was not noble but merely reckless, and that he had no right to drag her into the wreckage of his political career, and for a long moment they both stood on the edge of surrender. Then Alexander turned to face her and said there was something he needed to tell her about why this performance mattered, beyond politics or justice. And he began to speak about his mother with a raw vulnerability she had not heard from him before. He told her that his mother had possessed a natural talent for performance and had dreamed as a girl of pursuing the stage. But her family had considered such aspirations deeply inappropriate for a woman of her station, and had married her young to his father, who had forbidden any public display of her abilities. Alexander described how his mother had nevertheless organized private theatrical readings in their country estate, and how her face had transformed with joy when she performed, and how after his father's death she had spoken of finally pursuing her deferred dream only to be diagnosed with the illness that would take her life within a year. The morning of the performance arrived with a pale November sun that barely penetrated the thick London fog, and Beatrice woke in her narrow bed at Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, feeling as though she were moving through a dream from which she could not wake, her hands trembling slightly as she washed her face in the cold water from the basin on her dresser. Catherine had sent over a gown the previous evening with a note expressing her support, and Beatrice now lifted it from where it lay, carefully draped across her single chair, the deep blue silk seeming impossibly fine for someone of her current station, though Catherine had chosen well because the colour was rich without being ostentatious, and the cut was elegant but appropriately modest for appearing before Parliament. She dressed slowly and with great care, her fingers working through the fastenings with the same deliberate precision she had always used before stepping on stage, and she arranged her dark hair in a simple style that would not distract from her performance, avoiding any theatrical excess that might give the hostile lords additional ammunition for their prejudices. Mrs. Caldwell knocked softly and entered with tea she had not requested but deeply needed, and the older woman's eyes were bright with emotion as she told Beatrice that whatever happened in that chamber today, she had already proven herself braver than most people, managed in an entire lifetime. Beatrice embraced her landlady briefly before drinking the tea and gathering the few items she would need, and then she descended to the street where a modest hired carriage waited to take her to Parliament, because they had agreed she and Alexander should arrive separately to maintain at least a veneer of propriety. Across London in the grand rooms of Pembroke House, Alexander stood before his mirror in full parliamentary attire, the formal black coat and breeches feeling like armour he was donning for battle, and Robert had arrived early to stand with him in these final minutes before he departed for what might be the most consequential morning of his political life. Robert made one final attempt to dissuade him, speaking with the concern of true friendship about the allies who had abandoned Alexander's cause and the whispers that he would be formally censured after this display. But Alexander simply clasped his friend's shoulder and said that he had made his peace with whatever consequences followed, because remaining silent would have cost him something far more valuable than political position. He thought of his mother as he descended the stairs and climbed into his carriage, remembering how her voice had transformed when she read aloud from her beloved plays, and he carried that memory with him through the grey streets toward Westminster. The Chamber of Parliament filled earlier than usual with lords who had come from curiosity or hostility, or in some rare cases genuine interest in what this unprecedented performance might reveal, and the press had arrived in force, because the scandal of a duke performing Shakespeare with a banned actress before the assembled government was simply too extraordinary to miss. Lord Carstairs sat in a prominent position, wearing an expression of smug anticipation, clearly expecting the morning to conclude with Alexander's thorough humiliation and the final destruction of any sympathy for theatrical reform. Alexander entered first and made his way to the speaking area with his head high, despite the mixture of curious and contemptuous gazes that followed his progress, and he stood before his peers with remarkable composure as he waited for Beatrice to arrive. Beatrice entered the chamber a few minutes after Alexander, and every head turned toward her as she walked with careful dignity down the aisle between the assembled lords, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, and hearing the immediate rustle of whispers that followed her progress like a wave spreading across still water. She kept her gaze fixed ahead where Alexander stood waiting for her, and drew upon every technique she had learned in 10 years on the stage to maintain her composure, to keep her hands relaxed at her sides and her breathing steady despite the pounding of her heart against her ribs. The chamber was an imposing space designed to remind all who entered of the weight of tradition and power, with its high, vaulted ceiling and dark wood panelling, and rows of benches where the lords sat in their formal attire. And she felt keenly the absurdity of her presence here as a woman and an actress in this masculine domain of governance. She reached the speaking area where Alexander waited, and they stood facing each other across a distance of perhaps 8 feet, which would serve as the space between Romeo below and Juliet on her balcony. And for a moment their eyes met, and she saw in his gaze both encouragement and his own barely concealed nervousness. Alexander turned to address the assembly, and his voice when he spoke was clear and steady as he thanked the lords for their attendance and stated simply that they would now perform the balcony scene from Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet, so that the chamber might judge for themselves whether Shakespeare's words constituted a danger to public morality or a window into human truth. He did not offer further preamble or justification, and after his brief introduction, he turned back to Beatrice, and the performance began. Alexander spoke Romeo's opening lines as he gazed up at where Beatrice stood representing the balcony. His voice tentative at first, and missing some of the music in the verse, and Beatrice felt her own throat tighten with anxiety as she prepared to deliver Juliet's response, while hostile murmurs rippled through the watching lords. She began to speak, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, the words technically correct, but lacking the emotional resonance she had achieved so easily in rehearsal, and she felt the walls of the chamber pressing in on her as several lords shifted in their seats with expressions of disdain. Then something shifted within her as she reached the line about names being arbitrary labels that could not change the essential nature of what they described, and she heard in those words an echo of her own situation and Alexander's, 2 people deemed unsuitable for each other by the arbitrary rules of a society that valued titles over truth. Her voice strengthened and found its natural depth and power, and she felt her training rise up to carry her as it had through countless performances in her years on the stage. Alexander responded to the change in her immediately, and his next lines as Romeo came alive with genuine yearning, the stiffness leaving his bearing as he found the emotional core of the character. The hostile murmurs in the chamber began to fade as some of the lords, despite themselves, became drawn into the beauty of the language and the growing intensity between the 2 performers, and even those who had come determined to mock found their attention captured by the unfolding scene. The performance built toward its emotional center as Alexander delivered Romeo's vow with a fervor that transcended mere recitation, his voice carrying across the silent chamber with the words about taking Juliet as his blessed upon the moon, and Beatrice responded with Juliet's gentle chiding not to swear by the inconstant moon, but by his true self, and in that exchange something profound shifted between them, as the formal distance of performer and audience dissolved entirely. They were no longer a duke and a band actress standing before Parliament, no longer even actors playing characters from a centuries-old play, but simply 2 people speaking truths they had been unable to fully articulate in the careful conversations of their courtship, and every person watching felt the transformation, even if they could not name it. Alexander moved closer as Romeo pressed for some vow to satisfy his soul, and Beatrice took a small step forward as well, the physical space between them narrowing as it would not have done on an actual stage. And when she delivered Juliet's confession that she had already given him her love before he asked for it, her voice carried a tremor of genuine vulnerability that made several lords shift uncomfortably in their seats. The famous exchange of vows followed, with Alexander speaking of his boundless love as deep as the sea, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's face, and she responding that her bounty was as infinite as endless, and the words took on layers of meaning that Shakespeare himself might have recognized, the fictional lovers and the real people speaking simultaneously through the same breath. The chamber had grown so quiet that the sound of a pocket watch being adjusted seemed loud, and even Lord Carstairs' allies, who had come prepared to mock, found themselves transfixed by the raw honesty unfolding before them. When they reached the moment of parting where Juliet must leave Romeo below her balcony, genuine anguish entered both their voices as Beatrice spoke of parting being such sweet sorrow, and Alexander responded with Romeo's promise to send his love greetings, and the pain of separation in their delivery was not feigned or exaggerated, but drawn from the 2 weeks they had spent apart after Beatrice ended their friendship. The final lines approached with Alexander speaking of the peace that visiting Juliet brought to his breast, and Beatrice delivering Juliet's wish that he might find such rest while she remained restless until they met again. And on those closing words, her voice broke slightly with emotion that no technique could have manufactured. They finished with Alexander's final vow to forget himself as Romeo in order to remain with Juliet. And then they stood in silence, still locked in each other's gaze, the mere 2 feet now separating them, feeling both impossibly small and vast as the weight of what they had just revealed settled over them. The chamber remained utterly silent for a long moment that stretched and held, no one moving or speaking, and Beatrice felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall, while Alexander stood with his hands clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to close the remaining distance and take her in his arms before the entire assembly. The silence held for what felt like an eternity, before it was broken by a single pair of hands clapping slowly and deliberately. And Beatrice tore her gaze from Alexander to see an elderly lord in the 3rd row, whose name she did not know, but whose face showed an expression of genuine, moved appreciation. And then another lord began to applaud, younger and sitting near the front, and then Robert Fairfax rose to his feet and brought his hands together with firm, decisive strikes that echoed through the chamber. The applause spread unevenly through the assembled lords, like fire catching on damp kindling, some joining enthusiastically, while others sat with arms crossed and expressions of stony disapproval, and Beatrice felt her legs trembling beneath her gown as the mixed response washed over her in waves of sound. Perhaps a third of the chamber was applauding now, while another third whispered urgently to their neighbors, and the final third sat in hostile silence, and she watched as Lord Carstairs stood abruptly from his seat near the front, his face mottled with rage, and stalked toward the exit without a backward glance, his footsteps loud against the stone floor. Alexander seemed to shake himself from the spell that had held them both, and he turned to face the assembly, bowing slightly in acknowledgement of the applause, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same clarity and steadiness that had marked his political speeches, though Beatrice could see the fine tremor in his hands that he clasped behind his back. He thanked the chamber for their attention and stated simply that he hoped they had witnessed what he had tried to articulate in his earlier speech, that art at its truest was not a corruption of morals, but a mirror held up to the deepest truths of human experience, and that Shakespeare had understood something about love and courage and defiance of arbitrary division that remained as vital in 1818 as it had been when he first set those words to paper. Several lords called out questions or objections, but Alexander raised a hand to forestall further debate and said that he had made his argument as completely as he was able and would leave them to draw their own conclusions. And then he turned to Beatrice and offered her his arm in a gesture that was both courtly and unmistakably protective. She took his arm and felt the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his coat, and together they walked down the aisle between the benches as the applause continued from some quarters, while catcalls and expressions of disgust came from others, and she kept her head high and her expression composed as she had learned to do when facing hostile audiences in her early years on the stage. They reached the great doors of the chamber and passed through into the corridor beyond, where the sounds of debate immediately erupted behind them as the lords began to argue among themselves about what they had witnessed, and Alexander guided her quickly toward a side exit that would take them out to the street. But when they emerged into the grey November afternoon, they found themselves facing not the expected empty courtyard, but a crowd of perhaps 50 people, a mixture of journalists with notebooks at the ready, curious members of the public who had somehow learned of the performance, and a handful of people Beatrice recognized as artists and writers from the more progressive circles of London society, and the questions and shouts began immediately from all sides, asking what had possessed the Duke to perform Shakespeare in Parliament, and whether Miss Thornhill was not ashamed to show her face after her banning. The following 3 days brought a storm of consequences that neither Beatrice nor Alexander could have fully anticipated, though both had known their defiance would carry a price that extended far beyond the immediate discomfort of facing hostile questions outside Parliament. The newspapers seized upon the story with varying degrees of outrage and fascination, with the Morning Post denouncing Alexander's performance as a disgrace to his position and a betrayal of the dignity expected of the peerage, while the Times took a more measured approach that acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the event while questioning the wisdom of using Parliament as a theatrical venue. The more radical publications celebrated the Duke's courage, with one calling him a champion of artistic freedom, and another suggesting that his willingness to stand beside a banned actress revealed more nobility than a dozen inherited titles could convey. Alexander read these accounts in his study at Pembroke House, while his secretary delivered increasingly dire news about the political fallout, beginning with his removal from the Committee on Public Morals and the Committee on Theatre Licensing, positions he had held for 4 years and which had given him significant influence over the very laws he now opposed. 2 lords who had previously supported his legislative initiatives sent formal letters withdrawing their backing, and his secretary reported that at least 6 members of his own party were now refusing to be seen in his company at social events, treating his championing of Beatrice as a kind of moral contagion that might spread through association. Yet the news was not uniformly bleak, for Robert arrived on the 2nd day with reports that public sentiment in certain quarters ran strongly in Alexander's favour, particularly among the growing reform-minded middle class who saw in his performance both courage and a willingness to question the arbitrary authority of social convention. Meanwhile, Beatrice remained in her lodgings under Mrs. Caldwell's anxious supervision, reading her own collection of newspaper accounts and trying to process the surreal experience of seeing her name in print, not as the subject of scandal and condemnation, but as part of a larger story about art and principle. She received visitors throughout those days, some welcome and others less so, including 3 former colleagues from various theatres who came to express their support and their regret that they had not spoken more forcefully against her banning, and a stern delegation of ladies from a moral reform society who came to urge her to publicly renounce her profession and seek redemption through penitent withdrawal from public life, a suggestion she declined with firm politeness. The most unexpected visitor arrived on the 3rd day in the form of a letter bearing the seal of the Theatre Royal in Bath, written by a manager named Mr. Edmund Hartley, who stated that he had followed the events in London with great interest and wished to offer Miss Thornhill a position with his company for the upcoming season. Roles to include Portia, Ophelia, and whichever other parts suited her considerable talents. She read the letter twice with trembling hands, scarcely believing that opportunity might emerge from the wreckage of her reputation. And it was while she sat holding this letter that Mrs. Caldwell brought up the afternoon papers, including a scandal sheet that reported Lord Carstairs had been discovered to have financial interests in 2 competing theatres and had used his position to eliminate actresses who refused his personal attentions, revelations that severely damaged his credibility and led to calls for his own censure. That same afternoon, Alexander learned that the censorship bill had been quietly withdrawn from consideration pending further study, a parliamentary euphemism for indefinite delay that Robert assured him constituted a genuine victory, even if it fell short of outright reform. Alexander arrived at Beatrice's lodgings on the morning of the 4th day following their performance in Parliament, and the sight of his ducal carriage stopping before the modest building drew immediate attention from neighbours and passers-by who gathered on the street corner to witness what would happen next. He carried a bouquet of white roses wrapped in simple paper, a detail that Mrs. Caldwell noted with approval when she opened the door to his knock. And though her expression remained properly sceptical of a duke calling upon her tenant, she allowed him entrance after he stated his business with quiet formality that brooked no refusal. Beatrice was sitting by the window of her small sitting room, reading the letter from Bath for perhaps the 10th time when she heard his voice in the hallway below, and her heart began racing with a mixture of hope and fear that had become painfully familiar over the past weeks of knowing him. Mrs. Caldwell showed him up with obvious reluctance, accepting the roses to place in water, and then with pointed deliberateness she left the door to the sitting room open exactly 6 inches as propriety demanded, though Beatrice suspected the landlady would be listening from her strategic position on the stairs. Alexander stood in the centre of the small room, looking somehow both perfectly at ease and intensely focused, his dark eyes finding hers immediately, and he said her name once, softly, before asking if he might sit and speak with her about a matter of great importance to them both. She gestured to the chair opposite hers, her hands trembling slightly as she set aside the letter, and they sat facing each other in silence for a long moment while the sounds of London filtered through the window behind her, the calls of street vendors and the rattle of passing carts, providing a mundane counterpoint to the extraordinary nature of what she sensed was about to occur. He began by telling her that he had spent the previous night in his study thinking about everything that had happened since the moment he first walked into the bookshop, and found her there among the theatrical texts, and that he had come to understand something fundamental about the nature of courage and the shape a meaningful life might take. She listened without interrupting as he spoke of how her performance as Lady Macbeth had first captured his attention because it revealed an artist willing to see truth, even when that truth made others uncomfortable, and how their conversations had shown him the narrowness of his own existence, the ways he had allowed duty and propriety to constrain not just his actions, but his very conception of what might be possible. He leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together, and told her that performing Romeo opposite her Juliet in that chamber full of hostile lords had been the most honest and vital moment of his entire life, and that he had no intention of returning to the half-existence he had accepted before knowing her. Then he rose from his chair and crossed the small space between them to kneel beside her seat, taking her hand in both of his, and asked if she would do him the honour of becoming his wife, of building a life together that honoured both their truths and refused the limitations that society sought to impose upon them. Beatrice felt tears rising as she looked down at him, this powerful man kneeling in her modest rented room, and her first words were a protest born of fear rather than desire, saying that she would only damage him further, that a duke could not marry a banned actress without destroying everything he had built. But Alexander shook his head firmly and replied that she had already changed his world entirely, and that the only destruction he feared was the slow death of living without her, of returning to careful political maneuvering while the woman who had taught him what courage meant performed in Bath, or disappeared into some other distant city. She voiced her deepest fear then, admitting that she did not know how to be a duchess, that she would surely embarrass him in the grand houses and formal occasions that were his natural sphere. But he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, before saying that she had faced hostile audiences in shabby provincial theatres and transformed Parliament itself into a stage for truth, and he had no doubt whatsoever of her ability to navigate any social situation with the same grace and strength. The tenderness in his voice and the absolute conviction in his eyes broke through her remaining resistance, and she felt herself surrendering to the truth she had been trying to deny since the moment their eyes first locked across the speaking floor of the parliamentary chamber. She told him quietly that she loved him, had loved him perhaps since that first conversation about Shakespeare in the bookshop, though she had not allowed herself to name the feeling until this moment, and that if he was truly certain, she would be honored to be his wife. He rose then and drew her up with him, and they stood very close in the small, sunlit room, while Mrs. Caldwell's footsteps could be heard creaking on the stairs, and when he kissed her for the first time, it was with a gentleness that held within it all the passion and commitment his proposal had expressed, and she kissed him back with her whole heart, accepting not just his offer, but the future they would create together. The wedding took place on a crisp morning in early December at the private chapel within Pembroke House, a ceremony considerably smaller and more intimate than what would traditionally be expected for a Duke of Alexander's standing, yet it possessed a genuineness and emotional weight that no grand society spectacle could have matched. Beatrice stood in the small anteroom off the chapel, wearing a gown of cream silk that Catherine had commissioned for her, simpler than the elaborate confections favoured by most brides of the nobility, but elegant in its clean lines and perfect fit, and as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she saw not a transformation in her features, but rather a change in her bearing, a claiming of her place that showed in the straightness of her spine and the calm confidence in her eyes. Catherine entered to stand beside her as she had promised, and though Alexander's sister had initially viewed the match with deep skepticism, the past weeks had shown her the depth of genuine feeling between her brother and this unconventional woman, and she adjusted Beatrice's veil with gentle hands, while saying quietly that she had never seen Alexander truly happy until now. In the chapel, Alexander waited with Robert at his side, both men in formal mourning dress, and though several of Alexander's political allies had declined their invitations with various polite excuses, the small space held a remarkable gathering that included reformist members of Parliament, writers and artists who had championed Beatrice's cause, theatre people who had worked with her over the years, and even Mrs. Caldwell, who sat in the third row dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The ceremony began when Beatrice walked down the short aisle alone, having no father to give her away, and preferring the symbolism of coming to Alexander of her own choice and volition, and when their eyes met across the distance, she saw in his face such wonder and joy that her own fears about not belonging in his world seemed to dissolve like morning mist. The vicar spoke the ancient words with proper solemnity, but it was the moment when Alexander and Beatrice exchanged their personally written vows that the full emotional weight of their union became apparent, with Alexander promising to honor her truth and champion her voice for all the days of their lives, and Beatrice vowing to stand beside him in defiance of any limitation society might attempt to impose upon the life they would build together. When he placed the ring upon her finger, and they were pronounced husband and wife, the kiss they shared held within it all the courage and commitment their unconventional courtship had required, and the small congregation rose in applause that echoed warmly through the stone chapel. The reception that followed in the main drawing-room of Pembroke House revealed the mixed nature of their social position, with roughly half the traditional nobility notably absent, but their places filled by individuals whose presence mattered far more to the couple, including 3 prominent journalists who had defended Alexander's parliamentary performance, 2 members of the Royal Academy who had written essays about artistic freedom, and a delegation of 5 actors from various London theatres who came to celebrate one of their own ascending to a position from which she might advocate for their profession. Beatrice and Alexander opened the dancing together, moving across the floor with a grace that came not from matching social stations, but from genuine partnership. And as they turned beneath the chandeliers, she whispered that she had never imagined such happiness possible, to which he replied that she had taught him to imagine entirely new possibilities for what a life might hold. News reached them during the reception that Lord Carstairs had been formally censured by a parliamentary committee and had withdrawn from public life to his country estate. His influence in both political and theatrical circles effectively ended. A final defeat that brought satisfaction, though both Alexander and Beatrice agreed they would waste no more thought upon him. The following months brought the shape of their new life into focus, as Beatrice began performing at the new theatre on the Strand, a progressive establishment that welcomed controversial productions, while Alexander continued his parliamentary work with renewed purpose, championing gradual reforms to censorship laws and using his position to protect artistic expression. Together they hosted evening salons at Pembroke House that brought together politicians, artists, writers and reformers in conversations that crossed traditional social boundaries, creating a space where ideas could be exchanged freely and where Beatrice's intelligence and insight earned her respect that had nothing to do with her title and everything to do with her character. 5 years after Alexander Pembroke stood before Parliament and performed Romeo to Beatrice Thornhill's Juliet, the Duchess of Ashford stood backstage at the Phoenix Theatre, adjusting the sleeves of her costume, while her daughter Eleanor, age 4, sat on a wooden stool watching with the intense fascination that children reserve for their parents doing mysterious and important work. The Phoenix had opened just 18 months prior with funding. Alexander had helped secure from progressive investors, and it had quickly become known as the premier venue for productions that challenged convention and explored difficult truths, the very sort of work that had once gotten Beatrice banned from every respectable stage in London. She was preparing to perform Portia in The Merchant of Venice with an interpretation that emphasized the character's intelligence and legal acumen rather than simply her beauty, and as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she thought about how much had changed since that November evening when her career had seemed to end in disgrace at Drury Lane. The censorship reforms that Alexander had championed in Parliament had passed in gradual stages over the past years, not a sudden revolution, but a steady shift that allowed theatre companies more freedom in their artistic choices and provided protections for performers who chose unconventional interpretations. Eleanor asked her mother why she was smiling, and Beatrice knelt beside her daughter to explain that she was remembering how she had met her father, how he had seen her when others chose not to, and how together they had helped change the world just a little bit. Alexander entered the backstage area then with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged in theatrical spaces as much as parliamentary chambers. And when his eyes found Beatrice, they still held that same wonder she had first glimpsed across the speaking floor 5 years before, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune in having found her. They spoke briefly about dinner plans after the performance, and about whether Eleanor would manage to stay awake through all 5 acts, the comfortable domestic exchange of a marriage built on genuine partnership, and then Alexander kissed them both and went to take his seat in the ducal box that he maintained at the Phoenix, not for status, but because he genuinely loved watching his wife work. The performance that evening went beautifully, and from the stage during the trial scene, Beatrice could see Alexander leaning forward in his seat, and she thought about how their own act of defiance had required the same kind of courage that Portia showed in the courtroom, the willingness to speak truth even when doing so carried risk. When the final curtain fell and the audience rose in applause, Beatrice curtsied and looked up to find Alexander standing as well, and the expression on his face told her that he understood exactly what she had been trying to achieve with her performance. Perhaps you have faced a moment when the world told you to be smaller, to accept limitations that had nothing to do with your actual capabilities and everything to do with fear and convention. Perhaps you have wondered if it is too late to claim the voice you were told to silence, or to find the partner who will stand beside you in defiance of expectations that serve no purpose but to maintain comfortable lies. The story of Beatrice and Alexander reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act anyway, and that the most profound transformations happen when we refuse to accept the boundaries others try to impose upon our lives. True partnership is not about finding someone who fits perfectly into your existing world, but rather discovering the person with whom you can build an entirely new world that honors both your truths. Society changes not through grand gestures alone, but through the accumulation of individual acts of defiance, each person who refuses to be diminished, adding their strength to a movement that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. If their story has moved you, I invite you to join our community of listeners who believe in the power of courage and the possibility of transformation, because there are countless other stories waiting to be told about people who chose love over fear, and in doing so, changed not just their own lives, but the world around them.